Good day. Welcome to viewers in North America, good evening in UK, Europe, and Israel, and good morning in the South Pacific. It's exciting to recognize that the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is being listened to across the globe. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks for your support. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director and your moderator. Today we mark many important moments in Jewish history, and it's also day 3 of Jewish Heritage Month in Canada, a time to celebrate the achievements and contributions of Jews to Canadian nation building and excellence in many fields. Jewish Heritage Month is recognized in May in the US as well, while it is celebrated from September to December in Europe. Whichever jurisdiction you're in, the imperative is that you learn Jewish history from time immemorial to now. Defending Israel is more than just making a statement on Israel's right to exist. It is the celebration of a 3,000-year legacy that brought the Jewish people back to Israel, where they have accomplished the almost impossible dream of reconstituting the sovereign state of the Jews in their original homeland and rebirthing a language, a way of life, and rescuing hundreds of thousands of Jews from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, as well as from Ethiopia, and where Jews have successfully and wondrously built a diverse, multiracial, multi-faith, but wholly Jewish and democratic state. We have much to celebrate. Just days ago, it was the 102nd anniversary of the San Remo Declaration, in which the victorious First World War Allied powers committed to reconstituting the Jewish homeland in what was the mandate for Palestine. In July this year, it will be the 100th anniversary of the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations, which voted to reestablish the Jewish state. And despite all the illogical, irrelevant, dastardly anti-Semitic cries from the tyrants and terrorists worldwide, the UN itself enshrined this principle in Section 80 of its founding charter in 1945. Tomorrow, we mourn the loss of IDF's heroes who defended Israel. And on Wednesday evening and Thursday, we celebrate Israel's 74th birthday. We must teach to our children, as with learning the Shema. Maybe we ought to bind these words as a sign on our hand, fix them as an emblem on our forehead, and write them on the doorposts of our houses and on our gates. Maybe it is time that we truly understood the importance of every date, every agreement, and every broken agreement, every act that got us to this place in time. And so today we will hear from a few individuals who have been trying to teach us these messages. I would like to first thank our presenting sponsor, the Weiss Family Foundation, and thank the following organizations for co-sponsoring this webinar, for actively supporting the work of CAEF and partnering to promote Zionist pride. The Lawfare Project, the European Coalition for Israel, the Zionist Organization of America, Club Z, End Jew Hatred Canada, Eye on Zionism, Hasbara Fellowships Canada, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Kulano Canada, Atlanta Israel Coalition, the Mattathias Project, the Israel Activist Calendar, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, Adath Israel Congregation, Liberate Art, the Bedin Center for Near East Policy Research, Title Deed Media, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, European Lawyers for Israel, the Afghanistan-Israel Friendship Association, the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, Beth Tikva Synagogue, the Israel Committee of Sonoma County, and Habanistim, the Israel Defense and Security Forum. We are grateful for this and other opportunities to collaborate. Our partner in today's program is the UK Lawyers for Israel organization. And if you have not already watched some of their webinars, I urge you to. You'll meet their moderator, Natasha Hausdorff, shortly. I want to take a moment to thank Hugh Kitson, documentarian extraordinaire, for making the film Whose Land and for making it available at no cost to CAEF and all of our viewers. If you've not had time yet to watch this exceptional documentary narrated by Colonel Richard Kemp, you may yet do so, as it will continue to be available for the next 2 weeks. Use the link in the original webinar notice or go to our website, www.caef.ca. We would also welcome your donations that enable us to produce these webinars and our many advocacy initiatives. Whose Land featured several internationally recognized legal experts and scholars on Israeli history and rights, which should be taught in Jewish and non-Jewish educational institutions. So please share this link and its message widely. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website later this week, and you're welcome to send it to everyone on your list. Today, we're fortunate to have 3 panelists with special knowledge of our history and the law. After each has spoken, we'll take a few questions, so please use the Q&A function to pose your questions. Lord Reading, Simon Rufus Isaacs, is the 4th Marquess of Reading. During his working career, he's been a stockbroker, marketing director, and business partner to Prince Michael of Kent. He is a strong Zionist and a philanthropist. 2 of Lord Isaacs' great-grandfathers were around at the time of the Balfour Declaration, and both served the British government when David Lloyd George was Prime Minister. One of them was the 1st Marquess of Reading, Rufus Isaacs, who served as British ambassador in DC and was tasked with getting President Woodrow Wilson to support the Balfour Declaration. The other was Lord Melchett, who was 1st Commissioner for Works in Lloyd George's government. Even more significant was that he was a close friend and confidant of Chaim Weizmann. Lord Reading is the chair of the advisory board of the European Coalition for Israel and a defender of Israel and the legacy of his family. In 2021, Lord Reading applied for Israeli citizenship. Natasha Hausdorff is a barrister at Six Pump Court Chambers in London and the legal director for UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. She speaks frequently on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. Natasha holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities and was a fellow in the National Security Law program at Columbia Law School in New York. She previously worked for the American law firm Skadden Arps in London and Brussels and clerked for the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Chief Justice Miriam Naor in Jerusalem. Natasha sits on the committee of the UK Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and is a member of the Board of Deputies of British Jews and of the JD Corps of the World Jewish Congress. Hugh Kitson has been making documentary films for close to 50 years. I had to stop and think, 50 years. He's focused a great deal on, more recently, on making documentaries about Israel, and his latest production is the 2-part documentary, Whose Land? He has over 200 production credits and over a dozen international awards. The first part of the Whose Land series features the San Remo Resolution of 1920, was premiered in 2017 to mark the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. The second part, focusing on Israel's legal rights in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, is still in production. Hugh is the founder of Title Deed Media, a nonprofit documentary film company, and he's the director and producer of Whose Land? Recently, while in Australia, Hugh spoke on Sky News and is quoted as saying, "Anti-Semitism is a massive problem that is more prominent on the left, and claims that Israel is an apartheid state are just a plain and simple lie." I now invite Lord Reading to provide some background on his relationship with Zionist history.
I was going to touch on 4 aspects. One is obviously my ancestors' involvement in the rebirth of Israel. Secondly, about the UK's involvement in the British Mandate. Thirdly, on the European Coalition for Israel. And fourthly, just to reiterate about the importance of San Remo, which I attended 10 days ago. So first of all, to touch on my ancestors, I had 2 great-grandfathers who were both founding fathers of Israel. One was Sir Alfred Mond, who became Lord Melchett, and the other one was Sir Rufus Isaacs, who became the Marquess of Reading. Both of them were Jews, and both of them were Anglo-Jews. Lord Melchett, who was then Alfred Mond, founded a big industrial empire called Imperial Chemical Industries. And during that time, he was in Manchester and introduced Arthur Balfour to Chaim Weizmann. So Arthur Balfour had been the Prime Minister of Britain, and of course Chaim Weizmann became the founding father of Israel. So this was an extremely important, as it were, introduction, which Alfred Mond made. So on the one hand, there's him, and the other hand, there was my other great-grandfather, who, apart from other things, he was Solicitor General, Attorney General, Lord Chief Justice, Ambassador to America in the 1418 War, and was very influential in persuading Woodrow Wilson to give America the license, as it were, to approve the Central Powers decision at San Remo, and then became Viceroy, the only Jewish Viceroy of India, and the last Liberal Foreign Secretary, and the first Jew ever to be raised to the highest title, which was Marquis. So, in fact, I've had actually nothing to do with either of them, apart from just being their great-grandson. And I've done obviously nothing to deserve it, but I have tried to follow in some of their footsteps by attempting to be pro-Israel and putting forward the Israel point of view, because I find myself so often these days battling against those who have a different view and are almost all anti-Semitic. It's interesting to note that Lavrov, who is a foreign minister of Russia, recently stated that that Hitler was not only a Jew, but therefore that the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust, which is the most monstrous assertion you could possibly imagine, but does just show how far people have got the story wrong. But to come back to my family, therefore, they were very instrumental in the early stages of the rebirth of Israel. And in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, my Lord Meltry was in fact a member of the government. And for the next 3 years, of course, there was a considerable debate about making the Balfour Declaration enshrined in international law. And in 1920, of course, San Remo was enacted and became legal, and you'll hear more about this from Natasha later on. So that was my family history to do with Israel. And the next point I'd like to do is to talk about the UK involvement in Palestine between roughly 1920 and 1948, when it was given the status of a state. They started off well, Britain did. And we had the High Commissioners, Lord Samuel. Everything seemed to be going reasonably well until the Foreign Office got worried that Britain was upsetting the Arabs and therefore would not have access to oil. And this led to the MacDonald White Paper in 1939, which slapped a quota on the amount of Jews that were able to go to their homeland. I think I'm right in saying it was about 5,000 only, which was not under the terms of the original mandate. And furthermore, after the war, World War II that is, there was a Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevins, who was part of the Labour government, and he was very definitely anti-Semitic, in fact, admitted it, and Attlee went along with him. He was the Prime Minister. So unfortunately, we went down that route, and in many ways, I believe, we betrayed the British mandate. And this continued after the war, and of course, it meant that Holocaust survivors were not allowed to come back to Israel. In fact, some of them who did were put in the Athlete Detention Center. About 3,000 drowned in the Mediterranean when they were pushed away from Haifa. My wife and I actually laid a wreath there about 7 or 8 years ago to commemorate the deaths of those Jews who had tried to flee from the Holocaust to Israel. So it is not not a good story as far as Britain is concerned here. But while after the war, we had a government, a Conservative government followed the Labour one, and again, not much changed. But I am pleased to say that I attended a lunch in January where an agreement was signed between our Foreign Secretary and Lapid, the Foreign Secretary of Israel. And in it was signed a historic agreement between Israel and Britain. And Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, gave a rousing speech to compliment the agreement and to speak well of Israel. So I'm very much hoping that the tide is turning. So moving on from our involvement, British involvement in Israel, I'd like to turn to the San Remo treaty. I'll leave Natasha and Hugh to discuss this in more detail, but just as an observer, I would like to tell you that it was extremely well received by the Italians. And I think most Italians really never knew the details of the treaty. And we in fact had the mayor of San Remo who has said that he will buy the Villa Decca, which is where the San Remo Treaty was signed, and would turn it into a museum. We had the member of the European Parliament for that area, who was there and spoke well on behalf of the treaty, and also an Italian senator, and also the Israeli ambassador. So we had a good mixture of Italians and Israelis there, who are all giving their support to San Remo. And it's also been established that there will be a cultural festival at San Remo on the anniversary of the San Remo Treaty, which is literally at the end of April every year. And it's important that people realize that Israel has contributed so much to the culture around the world, and individual nations' culture. And so we had, for example, there we had a string quartet led by a German. We had a German Jew. We had a philharmonic orchestra, Italian one, again led by a Jew. and we've got a number of things, literature and other aspects of culture, which was also enacted upon at San Remo and will form part of the annual festival. So going on from San Remo, the final thing I'd like to talk about is ECI. I'm actually the chairman of the advisory council, and the European Coalition for Israel and its subsidiary, the International Coalition for Israel, was formed about 20 years ago. And its job really is to convince the nations around the world that they should be supporting Israel at the UN. We have an arc of nations. So these are nations who will support Israel, around about 42 of them. And we're hoping that they will grow. And one of the ways we hope they will grow is by, well, not only having a permanent representative in the UN. At this moment in time, we have somebody called Gregory Lafitte who goes there and back. But we're hoping that he will be a permanent representative there. So he will interact with all the other diplomats and ambassadors and hopefully expand the arc of nations. And also we're involved with the symposium in Berlin back in January of the final solution, which was really bringing together church leaders from around the world, that God forbid, if anything like this ever happened again, that the church wouldn't just sit on its hands, that it would do something about it. I mean, obviously, there are notable exceptions like Bonhoeffer, but generally speaking, the church didn't do very much when the final solution was enacted in January 1942. And we were there actually at the room where the decision was made in 90 minutes to exterminate 11 million Jews. The only reason they didn't reach that figure was because they didn't conquer Russia, and Hitler failed to do that, and there were 5 million Jews in Russia. But they, in fact, wiped out a third of every Jew in the world during that period of time. So that was really a very chilling moment, but it was good that we brought together these churches who made a joint agreement that they will work on this idea of bringing them all together and making sure that they will stand up for good and not do nothing about it. So that's my small contribution to proceedings. And Andrea, can I hand over back to you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lord Redding, and thank you for what you've been doing to assist Israel, to stand up for Israel. We all appreciate that. Everybody here owes you a great deal for that. I'll come back to you with questions, but first we'll go to Natasha. If you would unmute yourself, Natasha.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here on this distinguished panel at your invitation. So I'm very grateful. And of course, at this time of year, it's when Israel is about to celebrate its Independence Day. And amongst other things, namely, of course, marking the anniversaries of the San Remo Conference and also the British Mandate for Palestine. Israel's independence is what we are celebrating with this event. So thank you so much for organising. And in fact, this evening, as you indicated, marks the start of Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, which is inextricably linked with Independence Day, coming, of course, in the 24 hours before, in order to mark the great cost, both of the establishment of the state and its continued existence through all of the wars of attempted annihilation and the waves of terror that Israel and Israelis have been subject to. So I thought I would say a few words about Israel's declaration of independence and also about the status of the territory of Israel under international law. Now, these two issues are also closely linked, and the reason that I consider the latter, the status of the territory, to be of paramount importance is that it underpins a great deal of the misinformation that circulates about Israel today. It undermines those falsehoods, and it highlights the double standards and the abuse of international law against the Jewish state, which is something that we all need to make, I think, concerted efforts to address going forward. And I hope that the short explanation that I'm able to give will enable many more of us to do so and will arm our audience with the truth against these false accusations that are thrown around, that Israel violates this, that, and the other under international law. So first, the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, not every state has a declaration of independence. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, for example, do not. And most states that do have declarations of independence belonged to empires from which they had separated or ceded. And of course, that was often in the context of struggles of liberation. Now, Israel's declaration didn't declare statehood then and there. Its words were that the state would come into effect from the moment of the termination of the mandate. It was not in opposition to or in rebellion, but essentially as the successor to a vacated authority, which was the British mandatory power. The Jewish state in the Israeli declaration would therefore arise as of the 15th of May, 1948, essentially in a void resulting from the termination of the British mandate. And the declaration has two sources of authority, the Yishuv, the Jewish community in the land, and the Zionist movement at large. And the declaration draws upon the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country, as was, of course, recognized in the Balfour Declaration of the 2nd of November 1917, and also reaffirmed in the mandate of the League of Nations, which gave international sanction to that historic connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel and the right of the Jewish people to rebuild its national home. And in the text of the declaration, we have reference also to the 1947 United Nations General Assembly resolution, which called for the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. The General Assembly resolution, the declaration says, required the inhabitants of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, to take such steps as were necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. And in the Declaration of Independence, the text states that that recognition by the United Nations was irrevocable. Now, the declaration stated that essentially it was by virtue of the natural and historic right, and on the strength of the international recognition given amongst other forms by that General Assembly resolution, that the declaration of the State of Israel was made. And it is at that Declaration of Independence that we must examine the status of the territory under international law. And this is where we come to the second aspect that I wanted to touch on, because there is a fundamental rule of customary international law that establishes the borders of newly emerging states at the moment of independence. So in Israel's case, in 1948. It is universally applied, and it's a rule that developed over time. So in the 19th century, it was applied in South America. It was later applied in Africa and Asia, and still later at the disintegration of the former communist federations. And it was applied to all states that emerged in these cases. It was also applied consistently to states emerging from mandates. And for example, the mandate for Mesopotamia when it became the Kingdom of Iraq, also the mandates for Syria, Lebanon. So really in cases involving self-determination and states emerging from these administrative units, this universal rule for determining the borders of newly emerging states at the moment of independence was applied. And that rule dictates that a new state takes on the boundaries of the pre-existing administrative unit as its international borders. The rule is called uti possidetis juris, and it's a default rule. So anywhere there is no agreement to the contrary, this is the universally applied rule as a matter of customary international law to provide certainty, to avoid frontiers being challenged, to avoid wars breaking out, and to promote peace and stability. Now, those were the reasons the International Court of Justice recognized as being behind the development of this fundamental rule. Now, another very important principle of international law is its equal application. You cannot have a general rule and an exception for a country that you just don't like very much, or you have some political or ideological opposition to. That is not how any respectable legal system can operate. So the question we must ask ourselves is, what does this rule universally applied tell us about the legal status of the territory in Israel's case? Well, in 1948, the administrative lines of the eastern side of the British Mandate ran along the Jordan River all the way to the south. This originally, of course, divided the Mandate for Palestine from the separate administrative unit of Transjordan. If anyone in our audience is familiar with that part of the original mandate, which became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And by the way, Jordan's borders also followed the rule of uti possidetis juris. But when we come back to Israel, as the only state to emerge from that mandatory territory in 1948, it automatically assumed as its internationally recognized borders the administrative lines of the mandate that preceded it. And crucially, that included East Jerusalem and the West Bank, which was very soon later occupied by Jordan in 1948 in Israel's independence war. Now, those same areas were then recovered by Israel in 1967. The legal status of that territory applying this rule of uti possidetis juris is that Israel has been sovereign there since 1948. Now, that does not mean that this is the optimal outcome. Of course, that is a matter for negotiations, and ultimately it will be a political and security decision. But being clear on the starting point is critical because it underpins all of the legal analysis and it starts to reveal the onslaught against Israel in terms of international law is misconceived. Now, the Declaration of Independence established Israel as the only state to arise in the former mandatory Palestine. That declaration says nothing about the territory of the state, does not claim any particular borders of the newly emerging state, and it simply didn't need to. The reference in the declaration is to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and it seems to me that the declaration purposefully left Israel and the status of the territory open to the operation of international default rules like uti possidetis juris. And crucially, there's been no agreement yet of any kind on transfer of sovereignty since 1948. Now, there are a whole host of other legal principles and legal questions that essentially belie a great deal of the discourse around Israel, not least the question of occupation. Of course, that can only arise if one were to throw the question of uti possidetis juris out of the window. And again, that essentially would entail a double standard being applied to Israel. If I have a few more minutes, though, I may just highlight briefly some other double standards in terms of the wider treatment of the question of settlement activity. Again, it's an issue that is debated very hotly with respect to Israel. There are very important issues that underpin the legal analysis behind that, and ways in which the Fourth Geneva Convention has been entirely misapplied in this context. But even if we were to put that aside, it is important to establish what the position is elsewhere, and not just to look at the situation with respect to Israel in a vacuum. And there is a seminal piece of work by a professor of international law called Eugene Kontorovich, who has conducted a very careful study where he has compared places unlike the West Bank, where occupation exists as contemplated by the Geneva Convention, and in places where government orchestrated settlement activity forms part of the policy of the belligerent occupier. He's highlighted all of these examples in which essentially the international community has voiced no opposition at all. And so when Lord Reading has commented that he is voicing support from Israel in amongst a sea of opposition, unfortunately, I think we all find that that opposition is decidedly ill-informed and very much at odds with the wider application of international law. And the examples, for instance, that Professor Kontorovich gives include East Timor, where the Indonesian occupation involved large-scale settlement enterprises, which were run in a highly organized manner by the occupying power, and in a situation where there were specific demographic objectives in mind. Also Western Sahara with respect to Morocco's settlement program, an incredibly ambitious program transporting hundreds of thousands of settlers across a vast desert, in northern Cyprus, concerning the ongoing Turkish occupation, which perhaps constitutes one of the most substantial settlement enterprises. And of course, it's noticeable that it takes place within the territory of the European Union. In Lebanon's, with respect to the mass movement of civilians into occupied territory, which occurred during the Syrian occupation, in Cambodia, where several 100,000 Vietnamese settlers came to Cambodia during the decade of occupation by Vietnam. In Azerbaijan, with respect to the Nagorno-Karabakh region, where demographics have always been central to the conflict, and the substantial Armenian majority that existed historically has caused, well, Armenia has certainly encouraged substantial migration into that territory. And of course, topically, finally, Russia's occupation in Georgia, in Abkhazia, and in Ukraine, in Crimea, is worthy of note, in that there had also been a centralized state-sponsored program to settle people in that territory with the explicit purpose, again, of changing demographics. Now, those examples, I think, are significant because in none of them has there been any criticism of those projects in terms of the article that is consistently thrown at Israel, which is 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's one that many argue on the Israeli side of the debate, as it were, has no application. But in situations of real, no application to Israel, I should say, but in situations of real settlement activity, clearly the international community not only has not taken notice of it, but the consistent failure to raise this as a violation of international law essentially has the effect of legitimizing it under international law, in the same way that the rule of uti possidetis juris developed over time and came out of what we call custom. International law develops through state practice, the practice of states, and those rules can emerge over time as a result of consistent and general practice, as we have seen through these examples. So that's perhaps another aspect of the double standards that are consistently applied against Israel. But perhaps I'll leave it there, and I very much look forward to any questions in particular with respect to the application of international law, and I should say the misapplication, the abuse of international law with respect to Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natasha. That's very helpful. I do think that these are broad strokes that everybody needs to understand, even if they don't understand all the specific details that you've outlined. So we'll come back to you. I'm going to call on Hugh now, who has this, I would say unusual, but maybe not so unusual passion for Israel and support for the Jews. We'd like to hear more about where that comes from, why he made this film, and what his plans are. Hugh?
Well, I'll start with why did we make Whose Land? And there seems to be a tremendous void of knowledge about the history of the modern establishment of Israel, both from a historic and a legal perspective. And so Whose Land is designed to fill that gap. And it's really because of this lack of knowledge, falsehoods have come in. And basically, Whose Land is there to set the record straight. Now, we cover a lot of what both Lord Reading has told us this evening or this morning in Western Canada and USA, and also Natasha, and we do look at the legal side of it. And part one of Whose Land, which is up on your website, Andrea, and if you haven't seen it, I would certainly recommend that you view all of it. Actually, it's an hour and a half long, but and you can watch it in 10 episodes if you want. But I think you will learn things that you probably didn't know before. And if I can put it this way, as I see it, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a filmmaker and a storyteller, hopefully a truthful storyteller, the way I see it, Israel, the modern state of Israel, probably has more legitimacy in international law than almost any other nation on the face of the earth. Now, Whose Land Part 1 finishes with the Declaration of Independence by David Ben-Gurion on the 14th of May, 1948. And Part 2, when we're able to release it, complete it and then release it, will start at the same place. But basically, what is going on in the world today with the United Nations, their various agencies, the European Union, is that a whole series of lies is being told. And with that, I'd just like to show you a 2-minute trailer of what is coming up in the next part, and I'll give a little bit more detail afterwards.
هاي تل الربيع، شوف تم تسميتها تل الربيع بعد احتلال يافا. كانت يافا هون بس صارت تل الربيع.
هاي أرض الميعاد، هم بفكروا اليهود إنها ميعاد إلهم، لكن هي ميعاد لتجميعهم للقضاء عليهم بأمر رب العباد.
لقد بنيت خطتي على نار الحقد والكراهية التي تملأ قلوب اليهود نحو محمد وأتباعه.
على ضياع هيبتنا بسبب محمد.
Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's architect of the campaign to brand the Jewish people as a subhuman race in Nazi Germany, was quoted as saying, "If a lie is repeated often enough, then the people will believe it." A similar tactic is being used today in the propaganda war waged against Israel by Islam and the pro-Palestinian factions in the Middle East.
لكن نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يوليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا، لأن القدس عربية وأن فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربية فلسطينية إسلامية وستبقى كذلك رغم أنف هذا المحتل اللعين.
At the heart of the propaganda war against Israel is the use of fake history and lawfare, the revision and deliberate misrepresentation of international law. Whose Land is a documentary film looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law. Join me, Richard Kemp, in the two-part documentary film Whose Land, as we uncover the true story behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
That is a 2-minute cut down of a 10-minute preview, which you can also look at on Andrea's website. I think you'll probably agree with me that Colonel Richard Kemp has done a wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us this evening because he's traveling, but I was in touch with him by email earlier today, and he sends his greetings to everyone who's watching this. But as I said, part 2 starts where part 1 finishes. And what is generally unknown is that the Arab invasion of what was at that point in time a sovereign state in international law, it was as illegal as the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. There was no legality to it at all. And the unfortunate thing is that Britain, who had basically, and this is a sad thing, I say this very sadly as a British person, we basically violated the legal terms of the mandate on almost every single level. And as Lord Reading said earlier, we had a Labour government led by Lord Attlee, Clement Attlee, who was Prime Minister, and Ernest Bevin, who was Foreign Secretary, and they were both anti-Semites, and they were both determined that a Jewish state would not come into being. And so when Israel's declaration of independence happened, not only did the British government not recognize it, but they actually led the Arab invasion. The commander-in-chief of the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion, was a serving British Army general. And as such, he would have been under the orders of Whitehall. And so Britain was actually complicit in this invasion, which was a direct violation of Article 2 of the UN Founding Charter, which is what Russia has just done in invading Ukraine. And so basically what has happened, very sadly, the state of Israel would not have happened without Britain in the first place, but very sadly, in the end, it happened in spite of us rather than because of us. And this is really what Whose Land is about. Now we start part 2 with looking at the legality or illegality of this war of independence, the Arab invasion, which Britain backed. And Britain being one of the 5 members, permanent members of the Security Council, a bit like Russia is today, really acted, in my view, thoroughly immorally. But this has done a great deal of damage, this whole matter, because what it's effectively done is to turn the perception of Israel's legal rights on its head. So we begin with this, the annexation and occupation by Jordan of what they renamed as the West Bank and then East Jerusalem was simply illegal in international law. And we look at this and we talk about uti possidetis juris, which Natasha was talking about. Then we go on to look at the 1949 armistice lines, which in the view of the United Nations have become international borders, but actually the armistice agreement themselves said that they would not be international borders. And I believe the reason for that was that Jordan at a suitable time, wanted to go on and take the rest of Eretz Israel, if at all possible. And of course, that was what happened in 1967. The Arab nations attacked Israel, again with the intention of completely annihilating the Jewish state. So that in itself was another breach of international law. Now, Israel recaptured her ancient capital city and her historical heartland of Judea and Samaria, which Natasha has already talked about. And so we look at the legal side of that as well. And then we go on to look at Resolution 242. What does Resolution 242 say? We look at the Jerusalem law of 1980, that when the Israeli government declared Jerusalem to be the eternal and indivisible capital of Israel. And by the way, that goes back to, in a sense, the recognition at San Remo and in the mandate document, which is an international treaty, that the Jewish people had the right to reconstitute their national home. Well, the heart of their national home was Judea and Samaria, and the capital city was Jerusalem. And to this very day, certainly the British government does not recognize any part of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, not even where the Knesset is. So there needs to be a reset there. We then go on to look at the International Court of Justice opinion of 2004, and our team of lawyers, who, by the way, includes Professor Eugene Kontorovich and Avi Bell, Dr. Cynthia Wallace, Dr. Jacques Gauthier, Alan Baker, who is with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. We've got a wonderful team of international lawyers. Andrew Tucker's another one. And they look at all of these issues and they pull apart. They look at the International Court of Justice opinion, and they just pull it apart on legal grounds. So and on it goes today. I mean, you recently had UNESCO about 5 years ago declaring that there was no connection, Jewish connection to Jerusalem. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So what we're trying to do is to unpack the lies, reveal the lies by telling the truth, because so few people really do know the truth. And as Richard Kemp says, the tactic is that it's just the Goebbels principle that if you repeat a lie often enough, then everyone believes it. And this is what is actually going on. It is, it's Israel bashing on an unbelievable scale. We then go on to look at a couple of things that are a bit more positive, like the American Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the Abraham Accords, and then another big threat, which is the International Criminal Court. Now, these last three items we still have to film. Part 2 is largely assembled. We've got a bit more filming to do, but we also need to raise some funds to complete this and to get it out. In terms of how much do we need the equivalent of around 150,000 US dollars in order to finish this. But this is a propaganda war. The pressure against Israel is based very largely on lies and not on truth. But if people don't know the truth, how can they defend Israel?
Wow.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. And I think people are anxious already now to see part 2. So perhaps a few people will reach out to you and help with the fundraising. I'm going to go back and ask a few questions of each of the panel. So Lord Reading, I'm very interested in the role of the European Coalition for Israel. I know you're the chair of the advisory board. You mentioned 2 things that I thought were important, that the role of the coalition is to influence the UN to support Israel, and that you want to have a permanent representative. So in light of the fact that the United Nations is now really the bastion of anti-Semitism, and through the Human Rights Council and some of the bodies mentioned, UNESCO is another one. How will the coalition achieve that? What impact now is the coalition having with individual states that have stood out aside from Israel or against Israel?
Yes, Andrea, first of all, it's a battle. And just to get an extra nation or 2 to join the Ark of Nations is hard work. But what we're doing is, in fact, we've formed something called the Forum of Cultural Diplomacy. And we are appealing to diplomats and ambassadors to look at the Jewish cultural ties to their own nations. So rather than focusing on the sort of battle between Palestine, the Palestinians and Israel, we're focusing on cultural diplomacy. And that's a whole lot of an easier subject to discuss. And that is really where we are gaining a little bit of ground, step by step.
Are the countries that are part of the Abraham Accords in line with that? Because we never hear them speaking up at the UN, none of them.
No. After all, the Abraham Accords is what, a year and a half old. But you're quite right. The Emiratis, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco are the 3 key ones. And they're certainly very supportive of Israel, but they haven't actually spoken out at the UN, as far as I know, yet. But hopefully they will do in the very near future.
Thank you. Natasha, it would appear that with all the knowledge that we know the lawyers have within government, there's no way that every single State Department person doesn't know what you and Eugene Kontorovich and Jacques Gauthier know. There's no way they could have not known at least a part of this. Why do you think there's no action? Why, for example, in Britain, with the history that Britain has, is there no move to accept Jerusalem as the capital or to stand up for Israel when she's being demonized and threatened?
Well, I mentioned double standards a few times in the analysis that I took the opportunity to try and delve into. And the additional factor, Andrea, I think, is that we're increasingly in a world today where the value of everybody says seems to carry, even in the face of those fundamental rules of international law that I set out. I think there is an additional factor at play, and it's occurred to me on the basis that both Hugh Kitson and Lord Reading mentioned in their respective contributions anti-Semites and anti-Semitism, and it brings to mind the analysis which struck an enormous chord with me of the late great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, when he looked at what he called the evolution of anti-Semitism as a mutating virus that evolved over the generations, depending on the order of the day of society. So Rabbi Sacks explained that in the Middle Ages, when the focus of the Jew hate was on the Jewish religion, anti-Semitism focused on the religion, and you had the ancient blood libels that Jews would kill Christian children to use their blood to make matzah for Passover. You also had the canards of well poisoning. But then Lord Sachs explained that as science took over from religion, the focus of anti-Semitism mutated, and it was on the Jews as a race. And the pseudoscience of eugenics was used by the Nazis to justify their hatred of the Jewish race. And finally, Lord Sachs explained that society had evolved further still, and the current order of the day had even moved on to international law and human rights. And so the hatred of the Jews manifested itself in that context, and in the context of the Jewish state. And it strikes me that what we see in terms of the abuse of international law, which Hugh is also mentioned, and which I know the first season of Whose Land deals with tremendously well, and the second season has the promise of continuing that tradition. Those canards, those accusations of illegality against Israel are essentially the modern blood libel. And in that context, I think the difficulty of expecting Western governments to push back becomes a little bit easier to understand. The political capital required to do that is clearly immense, especially given the swell of public opinion spurred on by the way that these lies and these falsehoods are able to spread via social media in the modern world in which we live. And whether we like it or not, Israel is a very small country, and those detractors are numerous, and they speak with one voice. And so it's even more important that initiatives like Hughes Land and also individuals taking up the mantle to push back against these falsehoods and put the appropriate arguments out there about the international legal arena, but also to push back against these modern blood libels is so vitally important.
So just a twist on that. So do you see a role for NGOs in fact, our organization and many that are with us today are all activist oriented and taking issue with anti-Semitism, but maybe we're not coming at it the right way. Do you have any advice to us?
Hugely important role for NGOs. Of course, we are faced on the other side, as it were, with a concerted initiative by NGOs, which is, so far as I see it, part of a clearly set out plan. I mean, not many people seem to remember that, I think it was in 2011, Mahmoud Abbas wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, which was striking in that it was Abbas's declaration of lawfare, where he set out in very clear terms that it was his purpose to internationalize the conflict and essentially enter the legal arena with what we have now increasingly become familiar with as the concept of lawfare. And we have seen over the last couple of decades an army of NGOs being developed, which are incredibly well funded, that propagate the falsehoods and the misapplication of international law against Israel, and they have a very strong voice at the United Nations. But there are incredible NGOs that are holding back the tide on that and are holding those organizations that are propagating those falsehoods to account, and they're also holding states to account when they parrot those falsehoods. And we have seen, I think, encouraging pushback against recent reports by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, with respect to this appalling accusation, baseless accusation, that Israel is an apartheid state. It's another form of the blood libel. And increasingly, there are states that are coming out to criticize those reports, to push back on those reports, and to start calling out this development of NGOs whose raison d'etre is to delegitimize Israel. So the fact that we have NGOs pushing back against this, many of whom are representing the impressive list of sponsors that you read out for this particular session, is fundamentally important. If you ask me, the most pressing cause that we can all be focusing on is one of education, in particular at universities, because of course the next generation of decision makers is unfortunately growing up in an incredibly poisonous environment where the truth is being both stamped out and drowned out by those that are calling for appalling things to be done to Israel, but also delegitimizing and spreading those sorts of falsehoods that I think all of those here in the audience today are committed to pushing back against.
Well, thanks for giving us a little encouragement. We need that from time to time. I need to believe we're having some impact, and maybe collectively we can do more. And I want to ask Hugh, because Hugh, your film is the kind of educational material that we all need, right? Can you tell us, has your film been shown in schools or colleges? Are there any educational institutions that are taking it up, and how do we make that happen if it isn't?
Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is basically no. I did actually give a copy of Whose Land just after it was released to the current Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who was then the education minister in Israel at that time. And unfortunately, the education ministry in Israel haven't taken it up. It's available, by the way, with Hebrew subtitles. There's a shortened version of 45 minutes, and there's also the 10-minute episodes. And we've done all of these with Hebrew subtitles on, because I think as important as anything, the Jewish children need to grow up knowing something about the history of the foundation of their own state. And certainly we're trying to push this. So anything you can do to help get it into places. This is not a money-making venture, by the way. We just need to get it out there so that people understand the truth. Just coming back to part 2, if I may, because I think this is equally important with all the lies that are being told. And by the way, when we're able to restart the production of part 2, the first person we'll be interviewing is Natasha. And we look forward to you taking part, because I think there's a lot you can add to this. There are a few principles of international law that we haven't yet touched on. But just to give you an example of the double standards, the San Remo Agreement and the mandate and the rights given to the Jewish people 100 years ago were incorporated into the founding charter of the United Nations, Article 80 of the founding charter of the United Nations. So the recognition of the right of the Jewish people to reconstitute their homeland, heart of which is Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem, is there by implication. Now, Resolution 2334, which was passed in December of 2016, I think it was, they basically declare, and it's not binding, it's a Chapter 6 resolution. They say that any Jewish presence in any part of the so-called occupied territories is illegal in international law. Well, one of our lawyers, for instance, actually says that Resolution 2334 is a direct contradiction to Article 80 of the UN Charter. And people need to understand that the lies, and as you were saying, Natasha, organizations like UN Watch and various other organizations, Palestinian Media Watch, are contributing a great deal. We've interviewed Itamar Marcus, by the way, and we want to get Hillel Neuer on camera as well, if at all possible, because they don't seem to get the publicity, as with our films, that we really need, and we need to get it out there. UK Lawyers for Israel, which Natasha is part of, they've done what they can in promoting Whose Land, in a wonderful way. And UK Lawyers for Israel is one of those organizations, NGOs, that is doing a wonderful job, along with the European Coalition for Israel and many others as well.
Hugh, there are people in the chat asking how they can get in touch with you and how they can access the film. Do you want to just give us an email?
Yeah, yes, I'll write it in the chat.
Okay.
I'll say it first of all. It's hugh.kitson@titledeedmedia.com. So I'll just write that in the chat and hand back to you.
Thank you. And if anyone is also aware of potential funders, please let Hugh know. Right. Lord Reading, given the duplicity of the British government or British leaders at the time, does Britain have an ongoing responsibility? Does it not have, even today, some responsibility towards Israel that it should be held accountable for?
Yes, that's a good question, Andrea. And we've got an awful lot of ground to make up, if I can put it that way. And as I mentioned, a start was made in January with this agreement, this trade agreement, but also an agreement on Iran as well, that Britain would follow the Israel policy on Iran. So we've got a lot of ground to make up, and we need to continually support Israel more. But there are a number of people, both in Parliament, both in the Lords and Commons, who are coming off the fence and supporting Israel more directly.
That could be very positive. My last question, Natasha, I think you offered a great deal of insight into the legality, but we know that not all countries follow the rule of law. Not all countries accept international law. And someone put into the chat, and I think I'll credit my friend Murray Rubin, who's 91, who phones me every day with ideas about how we should deal with this. I really want to thank you, Murray. He wants to know what difference this can make if the Islamic countries follow Islamic law, which says that they never give up a piece of land they have conquered. So if they're not playing at the same party with the same rules, won't that always keep us at bay?
Well, the previous talk of the Abraham Accords, I think, is incredibly encouraging on that front, because it rather suggests that at least those members of the Accords have recognized that they have far more to gain from an alliance with Israel than the continued state of conflict. And by all accounts, the Accords denote a very warm peace. One just has to see the joint delegations of Israel and the UAE and the trips back and forth to see what does appear to be a real love and a people-to-people relationship, which is incredibly inspiring, and I think gives a great deal of hope for the future. But that is unfortunately a paradigm shift that we don't see across the Arab world. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. I'm not so sure that it is to do with Sharia, because of course realpolitik has seemingly trumped that in certain key respects. But what I do think plays a significant role is the approach the international community have taken. And I include the United Kingdom in that. And increasingly, I'd say from 1967 onwards, we saw a stance by the international community which was incredibly critical of Israel and very demanding of concessions. And one example that comes to mind under the Obama administration, so very much more recently, is in relation to the US position with vis-a-vis settlements. And an interview that I saw with Mahmoud Abbas at the time, who remains leader, of course, of the Palestinian Authority today, who claimed, how could I possibly be less Palestinian than the President of the United States, when he was addressing the official position that he was taking with respect to settlements. And I should explain that this was in the context of President Obama demanding a moratorium on building from the Israelis. And for me, that one example really portrays a great deal of the harm that the international community have been doing by essentially hamstringing originally, one might say, the Arab leadership in general, but more recently, specifically the Palestinian leadership, by an approach which may be described as very English, wanting to approach matters from both sides, or an English sense of fairness and fair play, which unfortunately, when it's translated onto our foreign policy, has been to squeeze Israel, seek concessions, and build up the cause against it, which has had a devastating impact. And unfortunately, despite the strides forward we have seen in some parts of the Arab world with the Abraham Accords, that approach of stoking up the fire, to my mind at least, has had the effect of pushing peace further away. And so if we are going to get a broader buy-in from the Arab world, the approach from the West is probably something that needs to change in advance of us being able to facilitate that.
In that case, I think Hugh has the right approach.
Yes.
And I'll let him have the last word. I have been saying for some time that it isn't our responsibility to portray our enemy's narrative. It isn't our responsibility to create balance. Our responsibility is to tell the truth, and the historical truth and the legal truth, as you three have done so today. And I think many times Jewish people get caught up in this notion that, well, all sides need to be heard and we have to portray their side. And this is happening in our school system and in our universities and in social situations I'm sure that many of us find ourselves in. So Hugh, the last word. Is there any reason in your films, in your work, to include a narrative that you have not with regard to the Palestinian Arab perspective?
Well, there is another aspect to this. I actually think in some respects we need to go on the offensive, not simply the defensive. I mean, we are defending a whole lot of lies. But back in, I think it was 1995, the House of Representatives majority leader was Newt Gingrich. And he got into a lot of hot water for telling the truth. He said, the Palestinians are an invented people. Now, in terms of their identity and narrative and history, that's exactly what they are. And even some Arabs have come out and said themselves that there is no Palestinian history. Today, you get the Palestinian Authority leaders that one moment they originate from the Canaanites, then they come from the Philistines. And really what we need to do is to tell the story of actually how they came to be invented. Now, I don't want to discount the today's Palestinian Arabs. They are an oppressed people. There is no doubt about that. And they need a lot of help. But it's not Israel that is creating their suffering. It is their own leadership. And I believe that we need to actually have a look at the origins of the belligerents, really, of the Palestinians, and I use that term, and their determination, certainly as far as the leadership is concerned, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, their goal is no different. And that is the destruction of the state of Israel, the Jewish state. They want its destruction. And I think we, to some degree, need to go on the offensive. And really, the ordinary Palestinian person needs to be liberated from this poisonous agenda that their leadership has. they are the ones who are responsible for the suffering. And so we're actually looking at the possibility of a part 3 as well.
Well, I think you've given us a great message to end this with, which is we must go on the offensive and not always be defensive. I would add that we need to be proud Jews, proud Zionists. And I would also add, with regard to the numerous sponsors we had, that we need to collaborate and cooperate with one another much more. We've got to get the Jewish world organized. And given our history, you would think that would be easy to accomplish, but it has not been. So I invite all the NGOs to continue to be in touch with one another and to let me know if you'd like to do more work with future webinars together. Thank you to our most esteemed panel, Lord Redding. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Natasha, I'm so happy to finally meet you and look forward to speaking with you again. And Hugh, best of luck in getting the next wonderful film done. We really look forward to sharing it. We will be happy and proud to premiere it here. Thanks, everyone. Chag Sameach, be well, and take care.
Thanks, Mayor. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea.